certain rules which are enforced by Salesforce to just ensure that any particular code or any process that is being executed in the backend does not kind of start using a lot of resources available. All right. So, and why this is important? Because Salesforce is a multi-tenant environment, which means multiple clients are on the same server, right? Now, if one code is written in such a way that it consumes a lot of resources, then it will not just impact the overall execution of, or it will not just impact that particular org, but all other orgs which are part of that same server will also start getting impacted. So for that reason, Salesforce has to bring in certain rules that would control what a particular org or what a particular code in the org can do, and what are the limits. The moment it finds that something is exceeding the limit in terms of code, so the governor limit applies on, because it's a multi-tenant environment, of course, everything has a limit. Now, the governor limit applies primarily on code as well. It is applicable on other things as well. But when you are executing some code, because that's your custom built logic for everything which is standard, Salesforce has predefined limitations on that. For example, how many objects you can create, how much data you can store, so or how many relationship fields you can create. Those are all standard things, and Salesforce has got predefined logics in place, right? But for the code that you are writing, Salesforce does not know what quality of code you are going to write and what exactly your code is going to do. That is where Salesforce brings in additional governor limits to ensure that that code is not impacting the overall server. So that's the concept here. What all things basically are controlled using governor limit? The CPU time or the CPU execution consumption. Your code gets of course monitored. Callouts, if you are making callouts to external system, that gets monitored. Memory, the memory consumption that is happening. Database, how much data can you retrieve, how much data can you update, etc. So those database operations are also monitored using governor limits. So we're going to talk a little more about that. We will roughly cover these topics. We'll talk about SOCL, DML, CPU time, heap size, callouts, concurrent asynchronous limits, synchronous versus asynchronous limits. We'll talk about bulkification, Apex debugging, and some of the best practices that you should keep in mind. All right. So again, let's come back to the same topic. What are governor limits? So these governor limits are primarily the limitations which have been enforced by Salesforce. So you can see it mentions Salesforce enforces per transaction resource limits. So the limits that Salesforce has set up per transaction, those are primarily the governor limits, and things which will have those limitations are your SOCL queries, how your SOCL queries, what sort of data you are trying to retrieve with the queries, DML operations, when you are performing any DML operation, when you are trying to update or create records, some sort of DMLs, the limits are on that. Callouts, when you are making callouts to external system, the heap size limit, the memory allocation per transaction, and your CPU time, how much of CPU time is being consumed. All right. Now, the big question: why governor limits exist? So the logic for that is very, very simple, and this is something which I just spoke. Let's have a look at this, image. So let's say we have got, Salesforce is a multi-tenant environment, right? So it's utilizing the shared resources. Now, if you see this, there are 5 different orgs which are using the same server, right? Now, if one of these orgs have written a code which is consuming a lot of resources from the shared resources, then it automatically starts impacting other orgs as well. It is as simple as that. So compare it with, let's say, you have booked a flight and you have been allocated a seat. Now, why is it important to allocate a seat or particular space to every passenger in the plane? I'm sorry. Why is it so important to allocate a dedicated sitting space to each passenger in the plane? The reason is pretty simple. The reason is that if if that is not done, if those boundaries, or if those um, what should I call? I mean, if the space is not defined, then what would happen? Some passengers may occupy a lot of space, which will then start causing inconvenience to other passengers, right? So that is the reason why you are allocated a seat and you have to be seated there. Similar thing here. I mean, not exactly the same way, but yeah, pretty similar thing here. So every org definitely has got their quota of how much storage they can have, etc. So that is there. In addition to that, because all this code is getting executed on the same shared server, the runtime engine of Apex also will get impacted if you have written a bad quality of code. And that is where, if you are trying to retrieve, say, 5 million records in the query, of course this query is going to run for longer, and it will start impacting the overall um, shared resources that we have, right? So that's basically the concept of governor limit, and that's why governor limits are in place. Now, when we talk about governor limits, there is a big list of, if you try to go to Salesforce documentation and search for governor limits, you will see a long list of governor limits which are there. But I'll talk about, first of all, let's get started with the key ones. I'm actually not going to go into the entire list of all the governor limits and why they are in place. I'll possibly try to capture a lot of those in some other video. But I'll begin with the top three, and then I'll talk about a few more here. The big three are the SOCL, DML, and CPU timeout. Okay, so SOCL limits are basically the limits which are defined on your SOCL queries. So SOCL query basically uh, is basically the limit which you will have in terms of how many records, how many SOCL queries can you execute, and how much data can you retrieve as part of SOCL queries. So with SOCL queries, what we need to do, our Apex engine needs to interact with the database. So there is an interaction with the database. So there will be a limit on how much data it can retrieve, and there will be a limit on how many times it can basically go to the database. So it cannot keep on going to the database multiple times or infinite number of times, right? So there has to be a limit on how many times your Apex will go to the database and try to retrieve something. And once it has done that, how much data can it bring it? And same way, DML operations or DML limits are basically when, again, here there is an interaction between your Apex and the database, right? Because you are trying to update some data in the database. Again, you will have limitations on the DML, and CPU time limit is basically the CPU consumption which is happening. If you have an operation which is running for a longer period of time, then what you have to do is, basically what Salesforce has to do is it has to cut that, because it's continuously running for a pretty longer period of time, right? So that is the thing. So you will have these limits there. Any code that exceeds these limits gets, that you will have a runtime error on those code. It will not get executed. Salesforce will enforce those governor limits, and the code will not get executed completely, right? So that is the thing. So just to ensure that our code continues to work properly on production environment, we need to be aware of these governor limits, and we need to write our code in such a way so that it follows, or it basically uh, adheres to the rules which are defined, or the limitations which are defined. Okay, let's talk about the SOCL query limits. So SOCL query limits are pretty much, you can have 100 SOCL queries inside one transaction. Now, what is a transaction? Transaction is one piece of code that gets executed as one single unit. It can be a method. So, for example, so if you have, say, 20 lines of code as part of a method, this entire 20 line need to get executed together as one single unit. That is called a transaction. So within a transaction, for now, you can consider the boundary of a transaction as a method. It can be anonymous code block, also can be a transaction. Your trigger can also be one transaction. But if you have multiple methods in trigger, then you definitely uh, are basically dealing with multiple different transactions in the trigger. Okay. if you're using a trigger framework, etc. So if you have too many SOQL queries in one transaction, that can trigger the governor limit exception. So that is the thing. So what is the max that it can go? It can go till 100 queries. Okay. Now, what is the problem? 100 queries is not a bad number. It's not really a bad number. Usually, you may not require 100 queries also in one method. The problem arises when you have a query inside the loop. So if you have SOQL queries written inside the loop and you are basically querying data one by one, then it will have a problem, right? So what is the solution to this? The best thing is to not write queries for individual records, rather try to do a query for collection of records and try to work with the data. So get the collection of the data and then start working with that data. The next limit is DML limits. So now there is a limit on the DMLs as well. So the DML statements that you can have inside one transaction, total number of DML statements that you can have is 150. So you cannot have more than 150 DML statements inside one particular transaction, let's say one method, right? This is again the same thing. So if you are trying to perform the DML for one record at a time and then you try to do it inside a loop, that's not the right approach. So you should ideally try to keep the DMLs outside the loop. So prepare your data and try to perform the DML at once. Keep it outside the loop. Okay, so that is the thing. So if there are individual DMLs being performed, let's say if you have to process 500 records, and if you are trying to write a DML statement for each one record and trying to run it through a loop, then you will hit this limit very easily. Otherwise, 150 DML statements inside a transaction is a pretty good number. You would usually not need it that way until and unless it is inside a loop. All right. So the purpose of now, you would see that the purpose of introducing these governor limits is also to ensure not to block you from writing the code, but to ensure that you are writing the code in a correct manner, right? So now the other thing is the CPU time limit. So CPU time limit, when does this occur? When you have complex logics, automation processes, running, there are multiple things that you have done as part of one transaction. And when it is getting executed, what happens is it is consuming a lot of CPU and it continues to go on for a longer period of time, right? So that is the thing. So your limit here is 1000 milliseconds. So if your method continues to get executed beyond that, of course it will not be a good experience for the end user, and this will not be a good thing for the shared resources as well. That is why Salesforce enforces this limit as well, just to ensure that you are writing your logics properly, you are writing modular methods or transactions, so that one transaction is not taking care of everything. So that needs to be done that ways. And if you have to deal with that slightly longer running operations, you will have to ensure that those are taken care of by asynchronous execution rather than synchronous execution. I'll talk about that as well. Then the heap size limit is there. Now heap size, this is possibly one of after SOQL DML CPU, I think this is one of the again main areas where you will have issues. So heap measures memory used by Apex objects. So the memory that is used by the Apex object, that is considered as heap size. So if you're trying to load too much data into memory, can cause heap size exception. So while there will be limitations on how much data you can retrieve, how many records you can retrieve, but in a transaction, if you're trying to do multiple things, let's say you retrieve something and then you try to do something on those records, and then you retrieve the child records, and then you retrieve some related records there and all. So that means what happens, the memory consumption increases again. This is where you will start hitting the heap size issue, right? And this needs to be avoided. So again, if you see, things are slightly interrelated as well. So in the previous one, when I was talking about SOQL and DML, I said, okay, we need to work with collections. But if you have collections, again, collections will mean that you are dealing with a larger set of data, which would mean that more memory is being consumed, right? So it's not that, I to keep one governor limit in place, I cannot be completely breaking the other thing. So we'll have to strike the right balance for that. Okay, now let's look at the query rows. uh, so you will have a limit of how many rows can be returned by queries. Okay, so if you have so ideally, the thing is that you have to work with the data that you actually need, rather than you trying to execute the entire uh, I would say entire set of records, or entire big chunk of data, and then trying to work with smaller set of data. You will have to write your queries in a better way, so that you are not trying to retrieve a lot of data unnecessarily. So just query what you need, apply your filters properly. Okay, now governor limits with triggers. Now what happens with triggers? Usually with your triggers, the governor limits are executed. With triggers, the governor limits are usually executed uh, along with the trigger itself. So triggers are meant to be executing in batches, or bulk, in a bulkified manner. So triggers run in bulk. So if you have a trigger that can run for one record, and the if same trigger would run if there are 500 records being processed, right? Now, if you have not written your trigger properly, your trigger will work fine for single record, but it will start breaking if you have more than say 200 records or 300 records, 500 records. Then it will start breaking, right? So that is the thing. So if you are using queries inside the trigger, DMLs inside the trigger, you'll have to ensure those are not inside the loop, right? So as you understand that, when we are writing a trigger is by default written to be executing in bulk, which means that there is for loop by default included inside that. So we'll have to ensure that we take out the queries, we take out the DML operations of the from the loop, just to ensure that we do not hit the limits. Similarly, we do have call out limits. I'll not get completely, I'll not get into too much of a detail about the call out limits here. I'll possibly do that as a separate topic. But HTTP call out also will have limits. So if you're, making call outs to other systems, etc., there is a limit to that as well. So you cannot be doing, multiple call outs to different systems. And what is the solution there? Again, the solution is pretty much simple. The solution is that you will have to ensure that your um, call outs sorry you will have to ensure that you are working with some sort of collections, and not exactly with the single records, or very small set of data. So you'll have to see, how and when do you want to interact with the other system. Instead of individual records, try to use collections. That will be useful. Now, overall solution that I have been talking about, I think, is more of uh, bulkifying the code, right? So now, if you look at this particular example, the code that is not bulkified on the left hand side has an update statement. The last statement that you see, that is a DML inside the loop, and it also has a SOCL inside the loop. So this is not the right way of writing your code. If you have SOCL queries inside the loop, it will hit the governor limit very quickly. If you have DML statements inside the loop, that also will hit the governor limits very quickly. On the right hand side, you would see after bulkifying how you should ideally work with this. So if you see, instead of writing SOCL query for each individual record, what I have done is I have basically created a collection. I have created a set of IDs, and then I ran one single SOCL query to retrieve the data for all of those IDs and stored it in a map, so that I really do not need to go into individual records. And same way, the update statement has been taken out of the loop as well, right? So this is how the bulkification will help you not hit the governor limit on a regular basis. Now there is another thing. So Salesforce also recommends that any operation now, if there are operations which are going to be slightly longer running, or are going to take longer, Salesforce has given another option for us to execute those code as asynchronous epics, and asynchronous epics have got comparatively higher governor limits as compared to what we get for synchronous epics. Now, with that, what happens? Your asynchronous epics can take care of longer running operations without uh, impacting, or without making the user to wait for that execution. Good thing about asynchronous apex is it is something which can get executed at a later point of time on its own thread, which ensures that you are not blocking your most important processes, you are not blocking your most important code logic execution, etc. Right? So that is what it does. So synchronous apex, if we just do the comparison, I'm not completely going into the details of synchronous versus asynchronous. Possibly that's something which is already covered as part of a separate topic. But if you talk from a governor limits perspective, your synchronous uh, apex have got certain governor limits, and comparatively, if you see, asynchronous apex have got slightly more governor limits, right? So that is provided. Um, and one of the examples of our asynchronous is also batch apex. So batch apex is one big thing. If you really need to work with a big chunk of data, then possibly batch apex is going to be very useful or very helpful there, because you can process the data in small batches rather than trying to process all the data in one single batch. So you have got, say, millions of records to process. How does the batch apex work? It takes the large data set and then it breaks that into batches and then starts doing the processing batch by batch. Similarly, Qubel and Future Apex will also do the same thing. Qubel Apex and Future Apex are again not batch Apex kind of thing, but it will let you first of all run your Apex code asynchronously, and second thing, it will also, if you want to line up multiple processes, like the first one gets executed, then the second one, so first job, then the second job, third job, that ways you can basically chain the jobs as well, so that your executions get into the pipeline, and once the first one is done, then the second one gets into the queue, etc. So that way Salesforce is also kind of managing the overall impact or the load on the server. uh, yeah, so this is pretty much the example of how a bulkified code can help you avoid governor limits. So the example here that is given is for SOQL query inside the loop without bulkified, and after bulkified, the SOQL query inside the loop. Okay. Now, based on the discussion that we have had so far, what we would do is we will possibly the key takeaways, if there are few takeaways that you will have to have. First takeaway is always bulkify your code. Bulkifying code means work with collections. Do not try to execute SOQL queries, DMLs, etc. for single records. Avoid, any sort of queries in the loop. DML statements can also be avoided, and you can have collections, and then you can basically work with those. Uh, you will have to reduce your CPU time, right? So do not try to make your methods transactions too complex. Do not try to execute everything in as part of one method. Try to make your methods modular, so that trigger framework, etc. is one such example. So try to use helper classes, methods, handlers, etc. uh, Control your heap size. Again, you have to understand that just using collections does not solve the problem. You will also have to try and understand that you're working with reasonable chunk of data for execution, at least for synchronous, and use asynchronous apex wherever there is a possibility. So I think that's these are the 5 key things that you should keep in mind, best practices that you should follow, and be aware of the governor limits to ensure that your code does not start breaking because of the governor limits. All right, so we'll just keep it here for today. I'll talk about some other topic, and I'll also do a little bit of detailed topic on this governor limit with some real examples in one of the next discussions. Thank you.